The Making of an Elizabethan Mind, a classical curriculum. Lecture 5, Cicero, the Voice of Rome. Before we say anything else about Marcus Tullius Cicero, we should say his name correctly. Rather, we should acknowledge that there are two ways of saying it, that they reflect two entirely different relationships with Latin, and that the difference between them is itself a small lesson in how the classical world reached the Renaissance. If you attended an English grammar school in the 16th century, or an English university, or an English court, you said Cicero. The S sound in the middle, the soft say at the start. This is the English pronunciation of Latin, sometimes called ecclesiastical Latin, the pronunciation that had been used by the Western Church for the better part of 1,000 years, transmitted through medieval scholarship and carried into the Renaissance without interruption. It is the pronunciation that Shakespeare would have used. It is the pronunciation that every English lawyer and clergyman and courtier used without a second thought. If, on the other hand, you were a continental humanist scholar of the strictest sort, or if you are a classical scholar today committed to reconstructing how Latin actually sounded in the first century before the Christian era, you say Cicero, the hard C, which is how the Romans almost certainly pronounced it, and which gives the name a rather more percussive quality. Cicero. It sounds, frankly, less impressive. This has been a source of some distress to people who have spent their lives revering the man. I raise this not to adjudicate between the two pronunciations, but because the question of how you say the name tells you where you stand in the long history of Latin's reception. The English Cicero is the Cicero of the church, of the law courts, of the medieval schoolroom. The continental Cicero is the Cicero of the humanist recovery, the attempt to get back behind the medieval transmission to the Roman original. Both are legitimate. Both are, in their way, honest. Throughout this course, I will say Cicero, because we are standing in the late 16th century, and that is where we belong. But now you know that there is a Cicero underneath, and that somewhere in the distance between the two pronunciations lies the entire story of what the Renaissance thought it was doing. Now, who was he? Marcus Tullius Cicero was born in 106 before the Christian era in Arpinum, a hill town about 70 miles southeast of Rome. He was what the Romans called a novus homo, a new man, meaning that no member of his family had previously held high political office in Rome. This is significant because the Roman political system was, in its instincts, if not always in its practice, profoundly aristocratic. The great families, the Julii, the Cornelii, the Emilii, had names that opened doors, that carried with them centuries of accumulated prestige, that told the Roman voter before a word had been spoken that this man was of the kind who governed. Cicero had none of that. What he had instead was a talent for speaking in public that was, by any account we possess, simply without parallel in his generation. He recognized this talent early, and he developed it with a discipline that was, even by Roman standards, remarkable. He went to Rome as a young man to study rhetoric and philosophy. He studied with the best teachers available. He went to Greece, to Rhodes, to hear the greatest Greek rhetoricians of the day. He came back to Rome and he began to practice law, and he won cases, and he won more cases, and the reputation grew. And by the time he was in his mid-30s, he was the most sought-after advocate in Rome and was beginning to look at the political career that the law courts were, for a man of his abilities, the natural preparation for. The Roman legal system was not like ours. Cases were argued in public, in the open air of the forum, before juries that could number in the hundreds, in front of crowds that gathered to watch, as they might gather to watch any public entertainment. A great advocate was a public figure in the most literal sense. His voice, his delivery, his timing, his ability to move an audience from laughter to tears to righteous indignation and back again within the span of a single speech. These were not merely professional skills. They were the substance of his public existence. Cicero's voice was his career, his reputation, his power, and ultimately his danger. He was elected consul, the highest office in the Roman Republic, in 63, before the Christian era. He was the first new man to achieve the consulship in a generation. And in the year of his consulship, he faced what he would describe with a tendency towards self-dramatization that was one of his less endearing qualities as the greatest crisis Rome had faced since the Punic Wars. This was the conspiracy of Catiline. Lucius Sergius Catilina was a patrician of ancient family and catastrophic finances who had attempted the consulship twice and failed, and who had responded to his failures by organizing a conspiracy to overthrow the Republic by force. The conspiracy was real. Catiline had genuine supporters, genuine military forces assembling outside Rome, and genuine intentions of violence. Cicero discovered the conspiracy, obtained evidence, arrested the ringleaders in Rome, and executed them without trial on the grounds of emergency necessity. And then Catiline marched north with his army and was defeated and killed at the Battle of Pistoia in January of 62. Rome was saved. Cicero was acclaimed as the father of his country, and the execution of the conspirators without trial, the decision he had made in the heat of the emergency, hung over the rest of his life like a sword on a fraying thread. Because the rule was clear, Roman citizens could not be executed without trial. The emergency procedure Cicero had invoked, the senatus consultum ultimum, the ultimate decree of the Senate, was of contested legality. His enemies, and he had acquired considerable enemies, waited. And 3 years later, when the political winds had shifted, they moved. A tribune named Publius Clodius Pulcher, a man who hated Cicero for personal reasons that were also excellent political reasons, passed a law making it illegal to have executed a Roman citizen without trial. Law was targeted with surgical precision. It had one intended victim. Cicero went into exile in Greece rather than face prosecution, and the experience broke him in ways that the letters he wrote during those months make almost painful to read. He came back. He was restored. He rebuilt his position. Then the Republic began to come apart in earnest, and Cicero, watching men he had known all his life maneuver for position in the catastrophe he had long feared was coming, wrote and spoke, and agonized and temporized, and occasionally soared to genuine courage, and was ultimately killed in December of 43 before the Christian era on the orders of Mark Antony, whose conduct Cicero had been excoriating in a series of speeches. His head and his hands were cut off and displayed on the rostra in the Roman Forum, the rostra from which he had spoken, the hands that had written the speeches. The symbolism was Antony's. It was, one must concede, effective symbolism. Antony's wife Fulvia, according to the ancient sources, took a hairpin and drove it through Cicero's tongue. Whether or not this is literally true, it tells you what Antony's circle thought Cicero's tongue had done to them. This is the man. This is the life. Now let us understand why the Elizabethans found him not merely admirable, but necessary. The answer begins with the obvious fact that he was the greatest prose writer Latin produced, and that his prose was therefore the standard against which all Latin prose was measured. When the grammar school masters wanted to teach boys to write well in Latin, they taught them Cicero, not because they had made an arbitrary choice, but because the consensus of educated Europe over 1,500 years was that Cicero's Latin was the best Latin, and that to write well was, in some meaningful sense, to write like him. Petrarch had wept over Cicero's letters. Erasmus had written a dialogue about the question of whether it was possible to write good Latin without being a Ciceronian imitation. The debate about Cicero was, for the Renaissance, one of the central debates about what education was. But the Elizabethans valued Cicero for something beyond his prose, important as that was. They valued him as a thinker about a specific problem of what a good man does in a corrupt state. This was not an abstract question in the 1590s. Elizabeth was old. The succession was uncertain. The court was a field of competing factions in which a misstep could end your career or your life. The question of how to maintain personal integrity while operating in a political system that rewarded flexibility and punished principle was one that every educated man in England was living rather than merely contemplating, and Cicero had faced the same question, had written about it with unmatched clarity and honesty, and had ultimately answered it with his life. For the Elizabethan reader, this gave his philosophical writings a quality the Greek philosophy, for all its grandeur, could not quite match. Cicero was not theorizing, he was reporting from the field. His treatise De Officiis on Duties, written in the last months of his life while Caesar was dead and the republic he had devoted himself to was clearly not going to survive the men who had killed Caesar, is perhaps the most practically influential work of moral philosophy in the Western tradition. not the most profound, not the most original, most practically influential. It was the book that educated Europeans returned to again and again for guidance about how to behave in the world, how to reconcile the competing demands of honesty and prudence, of personal loyalty and public duty, of what is honorable and what is merely expedient. It was written for his son, who was studying in Athens, and Cicero feared not studying very hard. It reads at moments with the urgency of a man who knows he is running out of time to say what needs to be said. The Elizabethan gentleman knew it. He had probably construed sections of it at school. He certainly knew its arguments because those arguments had permeated the political culture so thoroughly that you could encounter them without knowing their source. The distinction between the honestum, the honorable course, and the utile, the useful course, and Cicero's insistence that in the long run they are never truly in conflict, that what seems like a choice between honor and advantage is always, when properly understood, a choice between real advantage and apparent advantage. This argument runs underneath Elizabethan political thinking the way a river runs under a city. You don't always, but it is doing a great deal of structural work. We will spend our next lecture going into Cicero's rhetorical theory, the architecture of argument that the grammar school boys absorbed until it became instinct, and examining a specific speech in detail, not one of the Catilinarian orations, which are the obvious choice, and which we will certainly visit. I want to begin with a speech that is less often discussed, that shows Cicero doing something subtler and in some ways more interesting than the full-throated denunciation of a traitor. I want to begin with a speech in which Cicero defends a man he probably knew was guilty, and does it so brilliantly that the man was acquitted, and does it in a way that raises, with perfect clarity, the question that sits at the heart of the rhetorical tradition, the question of whether the art of persuasion is the servant of truth or its most dangerous enemy. That question, the Elizabethans understood, had no comfortable answer. Cicero knew it too. It did not stop him. It is, perhaps, part of why he was so good. End of Lecture 5.